After the fall of the golden age of Tang Dynasty, China entered the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, the messiest and the most convoluted period in Chinese history. As if keeping track of over a dozen kingdoms fighting for the dominion of China isn't enough, they keep using the same names for their kingdoms. There were at least 3 Hans, 2 Shus, and a couple of revived Tangs. In this episode, I will walk you through this chaotic period and teach you how to survive using Fanzi as case study. This career bureaucrat survived through all 5 dynasties and even became the Prime Minister of Song Dynasty, the next great dynasty to reunify China. Before I get into the flow of events, I think it would be easier to understand this period if I explain its general structure first. On the twilight of the Tang Dynasty, there was a massive rebellion led by Huang Cao. The rebellion was quelled, but in the process, various warlords rose to power and began fighting among themselves to gain more power and territory. Zhou, who was greatly favored by the Tang imperial court, ended up betraying it and deposed the emperor to make himself the emperor of the later Liang dynasty, the first of the 5 dynasties. The 5 dynasties and the 10 kingdoms period is a concept created during the Song dynasty, the dynasty that eventually reunited China. There were actually a lot more political divisions than what you see on screen. Many smaller kingdoms didn't even make the list. But you know what they say? History is written by the victors. So that's why the 5 dynasties were more prominently featured and the 10 kingdoms were turned into something like supporting characters in the historiography. The 5 dynasties are very significant to Song dynasty historians for a few reasons. First of all, they inherited the legitimacy of the original Tang dynasty in succession. The Tang dynasty was taken over by later Liang, and then later Liang was taken by later Tang, then later Jin, followed by later Han, later Zhou, until finally, Song dynasty launched a successful coup against later Zhou and went on to unify most of China. The other reason is because these dynasties were some of the biggest political entities located in the central plains of northern China. As for the 10 kingdoms, except for northern Han, which was an attempt at reviving later Han, all of them were located in the southern part of China. Yeah, the good old north-south division of China is happening all over again. Except for southern Tang, all of them were pretty weak and didn't have much chance of unifying China, despite some of them claiming the title of emperor. They are called kingdom in English just because someone decided to translate the Chinese word 国 into kingdom. But this word can be more literally translated as country. As you can see from the chart, these 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms did not exist all at once. Some of them were created later. And talking about creating kingdoms, we can't ignore the overbearing presence of the Khitan Liao dynasty, the king-making force that facilitated the rise and fall of some of the 5 dynasties. Alright now, without further ado, let's get on the history train. Before the Tang dynasty ended, many warlords and jiedusi, or military governors, already held de facto power over their own region. But when the last Tang dynasty emperor was deposed, and the later Liang dynasty was established in 907, some of the warlords and jiedusi also established their own countries. Not all of them claim to be emperors, because there can only be one emperor, and this title carries a lot of risk. It practically means that you have declared your ambition to conquer everybody else. And that could be fatal, especially if you are some small country in a corner. Some of them just claim to be kings of their own region, and others retain their title of jiedusi and pledge nominal allegiance to someone who claimed the title of emperor. As for the Khitans, they had just coincidentally formed their own khaganate up north in 907. They will adopt the Liao dynasty name in 947, but currently they are still in the process of growing themselves into a formidable force. I will cover the Khitan Liao dynasty in greater detail in a future episode, but for now we will just look at the general flow of the period. The first emperor of Liang dynasty, Zhou, was an awful person. He was originally a participant of Huang Cao's rebellion, but he changed sides and backstabbed a lot of people to get into power. So not many people liked him. Among those who hated him was Li Keyong, his arch-rival who he had tried to assassinate during their warlord days. Li Keyong established the kingdom of Jin. but it was pretty small and couldn't really stand a chance against later Liang. But his son, Li Cunxu, will eventually settle this grudge by conquering Zhou Wen's empire. Fan Zi was born in 911, and he proved to be a clever boy. But this is not his time to shine yet. Remember how I said Zhou Wen was an awful person? Yeah, apparently he was also quite depraved. He often called his sons' wives to the palace and fornicate with them. But this is not the real reason why his third son murdered him and took the throne. Zhou Wen wanted to make his adopted son his successor. But his third son, Zhou Yougui, murdered him in his sleep and forged an imperial edict to make himself the emperor. Zhou Yougui didn't last long either. His younger, fourth brother, Zhou Youzhen, launched a coup against him and had him assassinated. Stability is not really a thing in this period, and the term shifting alliance is the flavor of the century. In 915, a Jiedusi of later Liang died, and the new emperor wanted to reduce the power of the region by transferring the assets to another region. The military personnel rioted against the decision and invited Li Cunxu from Jin to rule them instead. The military personnel of this era are especially opinionated. It is almost like they are their own character in this story. Despite having to fight against the Khitan at the same time, by 923, Jin had grown powerful enough to challenge later Liang. They changed their dynastic name to Tang and conquered their longtime rival within the same year. They named their country Tang because they wanted to revive the glory of Tang Dynasty. Even though Li Cunxu and his father Li Keyong was of Sato Turkic descent, Li Keyong was granted the imperial Li surname by the Tang emperor for his meritorious service. So there is just a small connection there. Historians added the later prefix to differentiate all the different Tang and Han dynasties. Southern Han is another example of this. In reality, at the time, they just called themselves Han. Ancient Chinese dynasties usually named their region after the region where their leader became king, before becoming the emperor. The first emperor of the original Han Dynasty, for example, was made the king of Han region before conquering the rest of China and becoming an emperor. The other naming method is by harkening back to a glorious past dynasty, like what these kingdoms are doing. But starting from the Mongol Yuan dynasty, they broke from this convention because, wait for it, they are the exception. Anyway, during the later Tang dynasty, Fan Zi started his civil service. This dynasty took a step closer to unifying China by threatening former Shu into surrender. But then, it took another step back when one of the Jiedusi they assigned to the region declared independence and formed later Shu. This period is completely plagued by insubordination. Li Cunxu himself ended up getting killed in a revolt, and the next dynasty was formed by a rebellious veteran Jiedusi, Shi Tang, and he called his dynasty Jin, the former name of the later Tang dynasty. So historians came to call this dynasty later Jin, in their near-hopeless attempt to prevent confusion. Shi Tang was not powerful enough to win on his own, so he had to sign a proverbial contract with the devil to secure a victory. He asked for reinforcements from the Khitans. After he defeated the later Liang dynasty, he had to give away the strategic 16 prefectures, which included what would be the city of Beijing today. And also he had to call the Khitan emperor Ye Lü de Guang Father Emperor. He would assume the role of the child emperor, even though the Khitan emperor at the time was 10 years younger than him. Obviously, it was very degrading. And this superior to inferior emperor relationship would come back to haunt later dynasties. Coincidentally, with the destruction of the later Tang dynasty, the kingdom of Yangwu down south was taken over by Li Bian. Since the later Tang dynasty was destroyed and not using the name anymore, he just yoinked it and called his kingdom Tang. Historians added the prefix to differentiate the different Tang dynasties. This kingdom is pretty powerful, and it will eventually take over the kingdoms of Ming and Ma Chu. As a side note, the third period of Chinese domination of Vietnam ended completely in 938 when the kingdom of Southern Han attacked Jinghai Circuit, or Annan, and was repelled in the Battle of Bac Dang. But as if the chaos of the era was contagious, Vietnam soon entered its own turbulent period, called the Anarchy of the 12 Warlords. Meanwhile, during the later Qin Dynasty, Fanzi continued to rise up the ranks. But as you can see on the chart, this dynasty didn't last long. After the death of its founder, the generals and ministers all thought, you know what? We should really stop being the vassals of the Khitans. So in a small act of defiance, the new emperor sent a letter to the Khitan emperor and addressed him as grandfather. But he didn't call himself their vassal. And how did the Khitans react to this? Not very well. If they could create the later Qin dynasty, so could they destroy them. And they did. In 947, later Qing surrendered and their emperor was exiled to the cold and lonely northern region of Khitan. Ye Lü Deguang proclaimed himself as the emperor of all China. But he was very unpopular. Sick of having to deal with all the rebellions and the summer heat, he decided to return north. But he died on his way. His death emboldened the rebels, and one of them, Liu Ziyuan, quickly seized power and established the later Han Dynasty. But his dynasty was the most short-lived among the five, lasting only 5 years. Just after 1 year of reign, he died and was succeeded by his young son, Liu Chengyou. To support him, he assigned his Minister of Military Affairs, Guo Wei, to be regent, who proceeded to seize the throne like taking candies from a baby. The later Han Dynasty ended in 951. The Northern Han Kingdom was created because the late emperor's brother, Liu Ming, was supported by the Khitans to rebel and claimed to be the successor of later Han Dynasty. So they served as the Khitans' vassal and a buffer state against the later Zhou, despite their rivalry with the Khitans. When Guo Wei entered the capital, he remembered that there was a very meticulous bureaucrat who would make a great minister for his new dynasty. So again, Fanzi was hired to continue working for another dynasty. Well, if there is one lesson we can learn from Fanzi about surviving in a time of chaos, is that sometimes all you need to do is to just do your job well. And when in doubt, just nod and smile. Guo Wei's reign was succeeded by his adopted son, Guo Rong, and Guo Rong's son, Guo Zongxun, became the last emperor of the dynasty at the tender age of 6. Well, karma is a funny thing, isn't it? Just like how the later Zhou dynasty was established by a general seizing power from a young emperor, the dynasty ended the same way when its general Zhou Kuangying forced the young emperor to abdicate in 960. According to the official history, it was his soldiers who rioted, demanding him to become their emperor, while he was heading north to intercept a Liao invasion. He refused it a few times, but it was just a common East Asian fake politeness act. Throughout Chinese history, almost all emperors had done this stick, even the legendary Tang Taizong after his coup. I mean, who else was going to be the emperor? But Zhou Kuangying went method with the acting. He even cried in front of Fanzi, saying that he had no choice and he was forced by his men to do it. Yeah, right. But instead of rolling his eyes, Fanzi just nodded and bowed like the other ministers. And he was eventually promoted to become a chancellor of Song Dynasty. When a dynasty changes, usually you still have the same people running the bureaucracy, or it will just grind to a halt. The same goes for the Khitan Liao Empire. Just because their land expanded, it doesn't mean that all the citizens magically turned into Khitans. Real life isn't a video game. The Khitans still needed Chinese bureaucrats to run the sedentary part of their empire. After its establishment in 960, the Song Dynasty then went on to conquer all the other kingdoms and reunified most of China by 979. The Khitan Liao Dynasty then became its arch-rival. On the next episode, we will look at the rise of the Song Dynasty in greater detail. Who was Zhou Kuangying, and what is the mystery of his death? Remember to subscribe so that you don't miss the episode. Before I go, I would like to thank all our patrons on Patreon for supporting the channel, and all you viewers for liking and sharing the video. Until next time, stay cool, my bros!